I said no before I even knew what I was saying no to. That's the part I keep coming back to. My instinct knew before my brain did. It was a Tuesday in October, cold enough that I'd worn my good coat to the lawyer's office. The navy one I'd saved up for. The one I wore to job interviews and funerals. I remember thinking that morning that I didn't know which category this fell under. My employer, Mr. Tuel Calloway, had died 11 days earlier. Heart attack, sudden, in the study of the house where I'd worked for 6 years. The housekeeper found him. I was off that day, grocery shopping, and my phone rang while I was standing in the cereal aisle. I sat down on the floor right there between the Cheerios and the granola and just stayed there for a while. He was 74. He had no children. He had a younger brother who called twice a year, a financial advisor he trusted more than most people. And me. I was his personal assistant. Had been since I was 26, fresh out of a graduate program I'd half finished, broke, overqualified for everything I could actually get hired for. A friend of a friend mentioned that a wealthy retired investor in Westchester was looking for someone organized, discreet, and willing to work hard. I showed up in a borrowed blazer and talked for 2 hours about logistics and loyalty and what it means to actually take care of someone's life. He hired me the same day. For 6 years, I managed his calendar, his correspondence, his medical appointments, his travel, his household staff, his charitable giving. I drove him to chemotherapy when he didn't want anyone to know he was sick. I sat with him through the bad nights when the medication made him feel worse than the illness. I learned how he took his coffee, what music helped him sleep, which of his old colleagues he was still angry at, and which ones he genuinely missed. I knew him in the way that only someone who shows up every single day can know a person. His family did not show up every day. His brother Raymond lived in Phoenix and visited at Christmas and sometimes Easter. Raymond's wife, Joanne, sent birthday cards that felt like they'd been selected by someone who'd never met the recipient. They had 2 adult sons, cousins to a man who had no children of his own, who I'd met maybe 4 times total. They were polite to me in the careful way people are polite to staff. Not unkind, just distant, like I was part of the furniture. I never expected anything from the estate. That's the truth. I had a good salary, a small apartment in White Plains, a 401k I contributed to dutifully every month. I had a job I was good at, and a man I respected. That felt like enough. When he died, I started updating my resume the same week, because that's what you do. You grieve, and you move forward. He would have told me the same thing. So when the attorney's office called and asked me to come in for the reading of the will, I assumed it was procedural. A bequest, maybe. Something small. A piece of furniture he thought I'd like, or a donation to a charity in my name. I wore the navy coat and I sat in the waiting room and I read a 3-month-old magazine without absorbing a single word. Raymond and Joanne were already there when I arrived. I called Raymond when Mr. Tunt's Calloway died. It felt like the right thing to do. And he'd been polite, composed, asked about the arrangements. Now he nodded at me across the room. Joanne looked at her phone. The attorney was a small, precise man named Henderson, who had clearly done this many times and had the manner of someone who preferred things to be orderly. He arranged papers on his desk with the kind of care that signals the meeting is about to matter. He read through the preliminary language, the legal scaffolding, and then he got to the substance of it. Mr. Calloway had left his brother a painting, a significant one, an original that had hung in the dining room for years, worth more than most people's houses. He left charitable donations to 4 organizations. He left a small cash amount to his housekeeper, Margaret, who had worked for him for 20 years. And then Henderson looked up from the paper and directly at me, and he said my name, and he told me that James Calloway had left me everything else. The house, the investment portfolio, the remaining estate. I didn't understand immediately. I think I said, "I'm sorry," like he'd mispronounced something. He repeated it more slowly. The house in Westchester. The accounts. He walked me through figures I didn't fully absorb in the moment. Only later, only after. Figures that made the room feel like it was tilting. I became aware of Raymond very suddenly. The way you become aware of weather changing. He was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "There must be some mistake." Henderson said there was no mistake. Joanne's hand found Raymond's arm. I watched her grip tighten. I didn't say anything. What do you say? I sat there in the navy coat and I tried to breathe normally, and I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Mr. Taub Calloway, 3 days before he died, when he'd asked me to sit with him in the garden and we'd talked about nothing important. The way the light looked that afternoon, a book he'd been reading, whether I thought I'd ever want to live somewhere quieter than New York. I hadn't known that was a goodbye. I hadn't known he was already planning this. Henderson asked me to confirm acceptance of the terms. I said yes. Raymond said, I'd like a moment with her. Henderson gave us the room. The moment we were alone, something shifted in Raymond's face. Not angry, exactly. Controlled. The kind of control that has effort behind it. You understand, he said, that my brother wasn't well. He was lucid, I said. Until the end. He was isolated. He was dependent on you. That's not the same as making a sound decision. I didn't answer that. We're his family, Raymond said. His blood, you were an employee. I know what I was. Then you know this isn't right. He leaned forward slightly. We're not asking you to give it all up. We're reasonable people. But there should be a conversation about what's fair, about what James would have actually wanted if he'd been thinking clearly. There it was. The reframe. James wasn't thinking clearly. James was confused. James didn't mean it. James, who spent 50 years building wealth through careful, deliberate choices, somehow lost his judgment only in the specific moment that it mattered to them. He knew exactly what he wanted, I said. You can't know that. I knew him better than almost anyone. Raymond's expression changed then. The control slipped just a fraction. You worked for him. That's not the same as family. You don't get to decide what he meant. Henderson has the documents, I said. I think we're done here. I stood up. My legs felt strange, like I'd forgotten how they worked. I picked up my bag. If you walk out of this room, Raymond said, we will contest this. I stopped, turned around. Then contest it, I said, and I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 40 minutes before I could drive. I wasn't crying. I was doing the thing I do when too much happens at once. I go very quiet and very still, and I wait for my brain to catch up with my body. I'd been doing it since I was a kid. My mother called it going somewhere else. She never meant it as a compliment. I called my friend Jade, who is the most practical person I know and who I trust with the things I can't say out loud yet. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Don't do anything yet. Don't say anything to anyone. Come over tonight and we'll figure out what you need to do. Jade's kitchen table has been where I've made most of the important decisions of my adult life. I drove there that evening and she made pasta and we sat across from each other and she helped me think through it the way she always does. Methodically, without panic, without pretending it was smaller than it was. Are you going to accept it? She asked. I already did. In the meeting. I mean really accept it. Live in the house. Use the money. I looked at my hands around the wine glass. He wanted me to? That's not the same as what you want. I know. I thought about the garden. The way he'd looked out at it that last afternoon. Not sad exactly, but retrospective. Like he was taking inventory of everything he loved. But he thought about this. He didn't just dash this off. This was planned. I think he'd been planning it for a while. Then honor it, Jade said simply. I moved into the house 3 weeks later. Raymond called twice in November. Both times he asked to meet. Both times I said I needed more time. I wasn't being evasive. I genuinely needed more time. I was still sleeping in the guest room because the master bedroom felt like too much. Still eating cereal for dinner because I didn't know how to cook in a kitchen that large. Still waking up at 5 a.m., convinced I'd forgotten something urgent that needed to be done for someone who was no longer alive to need it. The financial advisor, whose name was Preston and who turned out to be exactly as trustworthy as Mr. Calloway had said, walked me through the accounts over 3 meetings. He was patient. He didn't talk to me like I was naive, even though I was, in that world. He explained things twice when I asked and didn't make me feel foolish for asking. He talked about you, Preston told me at our 3rd meeting. In the last year especially. He said you were the most capable person he'd worked with in 40 years. He said he couldn't think of anyone who would take better care of what he'd built. I didn't trust myself to respond to that. I just nodded and looked at the papers. December came. Raymond sent a letter through his own attorney. It said, in legal language, that the family intended to challenge the will on grounds of undue influence, that they had concerns about my position of authority over a vulnerable elderly man, that they believed I had manipulated the situation to my benefit. I read it 3 times. I felt sick the first time, angry the second time. By the third time, something had settled in me, a kind of clarity that I recognized. The same thing I'd felt in Henderson's office when Raymond said, "You were an employee." And I felt, not hurt exactly, but certain. Certain that I knew what I knew, and no amount of reframing would change it. I hired an attorney, a good one, a woman named Okafor who specialized in estate litigation and who had a way of making you feel that the truth was simply a problem to be organized correctly. She reviewed everything. The will, the timeline, the documentation of Mr. Calloway's medical records, his cognitive evaluations, his correspondence. He was methodical, she said. He revised this will 18 months ago with full documentation. He had a capacity evaluation done at his own request. He wrote a letter of intent that's attached to the filing explaining his reasoning. She looked at me over her glasses. He anticipated this. He knew they would challenge it. He built the answer before they asked the question. I thought about that for a long time. January was hard in ways I hadn't expected. Not because of Raymond. Okafor was handling that with a competence that made me feel almost calm about it, but because of the loneliness of it. Wealth, it turns out, creates a particular kind of isolation. Every person who reached out suddenly felt suspect. A college acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in 3 years sent a long message asking how I was doing. A man I'd been on 2 dates with the previous spring texted out of nowhere. My own cousin, who I liked, called, and the whole conversation I kept waiting for the ask, and there wasn't one, and afterward I felt ashamed of myself for waiting. Jade noticed. She always does. "You're allowed to trust people," she said. "Not blindly, but you're allowed." "He didn't have anyone by the end," I said. "He had me and Preston and Margaret and a handful of people who called on his birthday. That's what I'm going to have." "That's not true, and you know it." "How do I know the difference?" She thought about it. "The same way you knew with him. You paid attention. You showed up. You let it take time." She shrugged. "There's no shortcut. There never was." I walked in the garden that evening, the same paths I'd walked with him. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes everything sharp and clear. I thought about what it means to steward something. Not own it, exactly, but be responsible for it. He'd been responsible for things his whole life. Companies, investments, people who worked for him. Now it was mine to figure out. I didn't feel ready. I wasn't sure I was supposed to. February brought the deposition. Raymond's attorney was efficient and aggressive in the way that communicates a case that isn't quite as strong as the billing suggests. He asked me about my relationship with Mr. Calloway. He asked how often I'd been present for medical appointments. He asked whether I'd ever discussed the will with the deceased. "Once," I said. About 8 months before he died, Mr. Calloway had told me he was updating his estate documents and that I should expect to hear from his attorney after his passing. I told him I hoped that was a very long time from now. He'd laughed and said, "Probably not." But that was all right. He'd had a good run. Raymond's attorney paused. "He told you directly." "Yes, and you didn't inform the family." "That wasn't my information to share." He wrote something on his notepad. "Isn't it possible," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that a woman in your position, living in the house, managing every aspect of his life, might have influenced his decisions in ways that felt natural to her but constituted undue pressure on a vulnerable man?" Okafor said something quiet beside me. I answered anyway. "He was not vulnerable in the way you're describing," I said. "He was methodical and deliberate, and he made every decision with his eyes open. Calling him vulnerable because he valued the people who showed up is the real disrespect to his memory. Not what I'm doing." There was a silence. Raymond was sitting across the room, and for a moment our eyes met, and I saw something in his face I hadn't expected. Not anger. Something more complicated. Grief, maybe. Guilt. The specific expression of someone who knows they arrived too late to a relationship they let lapse and is now trying to reclaim it through paperwork. I felt, briefly, sorry for him. And then I felt the limits of that sorrow. The challenge was dropped in March. Okafor called me on a Wednesday morning, matter of fact, the way she handled everything. Raymond's attorney had filed the withdrawal. The reasons weren't specified. Probably the capacity evaluation and the letter of intent. Probably the 18 months of documentation. Probably the simple, boring, unassailable truth of it. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after she hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. That surprised me. I'd expected to feel something bigger, relief at minimum, satisfaction maybe. What I felt instead was something quieter. A door closing. The last argument about what he meant, finally finished. I went out to the garden. It was early March, still cold, the ground hard, nothing growing yet. But there were buds on the trees he'd planted along the east wall 15 years ago, he'd told me, when he first bought the house. He'd been patient with them. They were tall now. I stood there for a long time, not thinking about Raymond or the deposition or the accounts or what came next, just standing there in the cold, looking at the trees. I still live in the house. I kept Margaret on. She'd worked there longer than I had, and the idea of the house without her felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite explain. Preston continued managing the investments, and we meet monthly now, and I've learned more in the past year than I did in 6 years of graduate school about how money actually works. I set up a scholarship fund through a community college 30 miles north of the city, a full ride for students coming back to education after a gap. Students like me, who had ability and not quite enough time or money to use it properly. It was the first thing I did with the estate beyond the immediate necessities, and it felt like the right first thing. Jade came to the house for dinner in April. She walked around the garden, and then she sat at the kitchen table and she looked at me across it and she said, "You seem like yourself." "I think I am," I said. "Good." She picked up her wine glass. He would have wanted that. I thought about those last conversations in the garden, the light he'd mentioned, the book, whether I'd ever want to live somewhere quieter. He'd been so specific that day, so present. I hadn't understood it then. He wasn't saying goodbye. He was showing me something. He was showing me what it looked like to have lived in a place long enough to love it, so I would know what to do with it. I think about that when I wake up early, before the house is fully light, and I walk down the hall and make coffee in that kitchen that was too big for a while and isn't anymore. I think about it when I stand at the window and watch the birds he named individually, which I also now name individually, because once you start you can't stop. I think about it in the evenings, when I walk the east wall and the trees he planted press up against the sky, patient and present and reaching, the way good things do when you give them enough time and don't ask them to be anything other than what they are. I got it wrong at first. What had been given to me? I thought it was money. I thought it was a house. But that's not what he left me. He left me the thing he'd spent a lifetime learning: how to pay attention to what matters and how to stay. I used to think that doing the right thing protected you from hard things. That if you showed up honestly, worked hard, cared without an agenda, the world would somehow be fair in return. I don't believe that anymore. Not because I became cynical, but because I learned something more useful than that comfortable idea. What I learned is this: the consequences of how you live don't always show up on your timeline. Sometimes they show up years later in a lawyer's office, in a document someone spent 18 months preparing in silence because they knew what was coming after they were gone. Raymond didn't lose that case because of luck. He lost it because Mr. Calloway had spent decades paying attention to what integrity actually looks like in practice. He'd watched people perform loyalty and perform care, and he'd watched me just do it, without performance, without expectation. That's not sentiment. That's evidence. And when Raymond's attorney sat across from 18 months of documentation and a capacity evaluation that Mr. Calloway had requested himself, not because anyone told him to, but because he was a methodical man who understood that truth needs to be recorded, there was nothing left to argue. The case didn't collapse because the law favored me. It collapsed because reality did. I think about that when I consider the choices I made during those 6 years. I wasn't building toward anything. I wasn't strategic. I drove him to chemotherapy because he needed someone to drive him. I sat through the bad nights because leaving felt wrong. I learned how he took his coffee because it mattered to him and therefore it mattered to me. None of that was calculated, but all of it was real. And reality, it turns out, is harder to contest than a feeling. There's something in that we're sitting with. Not as a formula, do good things and good things return, because that's too simple and sometimes too false. But as a reminder that the way you treat people when nothing is at stake is exactly the kind of thing that becomes the record of your life. Mr. Calloway knew what he was doing when he made his decision. He wasn't confused. He was a man who had spent 50 years watching how people behave when they think it doesn't count. Raymond arrived when it counted. I was there when it didn't. That's the whole story, really. What stayed with me most wasn't winning. It was the letter of intent. The document Mr. Calloway had written, attached to the will, explaining his reasoning in his own words. I didn't read it until after the case was dropped. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and I read it twice, and the thing that undid me wasn't the legal language or the financial details. It was a single sentence near the end. He wrote that he hoped I would learn, through inheriting what he'd built, that a life constructed around genuine attention to others is not a sacrifice. It is the architecture of a good life. I'm still learning what that means. I think I'll be learning it for a long time, but I'm learning it in his garden, in his house, which is my house now, walking paths he loved, tending things he planted. The trees along the east wall are taller every spring. He was patient with them. I'm trying to be patient too, with the uncertainty, with the process of figuring out who I am in a life I didn't plan for. That patience is not passive. It's a decision made again every morning. To stay. To pay attention. To build something worth leaving.